Today, we return once again to the story of Abraham. And what I'd like to discuss in our time today is actually a fairly brief point in what we read of Abraham's story in Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 13. But I think its implications, not only with respect to Abraham, but really with respect to the entire Bible and with respect to us, are important enough that it warrants our special attention. We begin our discussion in Genesis chapter 12. Abraham has just entered the promised land, the land of Israel. And in verse 6, we read, "And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, unto the terebinth of Moreh," and the Canaanite was then in the land. And, instantaneously, a question arises. Because as we have had occasion to note on many occasions in the past, even when the Bible teaches us about historical events, it's not there to teach us history. It certainly is not a history book. And inevitably, recognizing that, when all is said and done, in a lifespan for Abraham of 175 years, and for Sarah of 127 years, the Bible doesn't tell us an awful lot. Obviously, it excerpts only those parts of the story that are critical for us, that are, in the truest, most literal sense of the word Torah, which we have noted many times means teaching, that are teaching. They're teaching us something for our lives. So is Abraham's travel itinerary really so important that we need to know about it? And then in verse 7, we read of God's promise that God appeared unto Abram and said, "Unto your seed will I give this land." And I suppose we can well appreciate that Abraham's reaction is he built there an altar unto God who appeared to him. Well, that clearly is a spiritual response. An altar, after all, is means through which to draw close to God. But then in the next verse, we're back with the travel itinerary. "And he removed from thence unto the mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west, and Ai on the east." And again, there's the theme of the altar. He built there an altar unto God and called upon, or we prefer the translation, in the name of God. That is, calling in the name of God is, on the one hand, an expression that is subject to a variety of interpretations. But for our purposes, I think the most compelling, this is a proposal made by some of our classic Bible scholars, notably Rabbi Moses Nachmanides, one of the great scholars of the Bible in the 13th century, that calling in the name of God means announcing his spiritual mission to the world. So Abraham was out there by his altar, calling in the name of God, telling all of humanity about God. And then, verse 9, we're back to the travel itinerary. "And Abraham journeyed, going on still toward the south." Well, it doesn't end in chapter 12. That is, when we continue in chapter 13, upon Abraham and Sarah's return from Egypt. Again, he went up out of Egypt at the beginning of chapter 13, and verse 3, we return to the itinerary. And he went on his journeys from the south, even to Beit El, onto the place where his tent had been at the beginning between Beit El and Ai, unto the place of the altar which he had made there at the first. Again, there's the altar. And again, Abraham called thereon, or we'll prefer, in the name of God, same mission, to proclaim God's name to a world that didn't know it. And of course, once more, we can readily understand the spiritual aspect here. You know, the altar, calling out in God's name, but why the travels? And we're still not finished with it. That is, that aspect of the land, what the land signifies, again reasserts itself in chapter 13, verse 14. God says to Abraham, lift up now your eyes and look from the place where you are, north, south, east, and west. For all the land that you see, I will give you and your seed forever. That aspect of land, aretz, is also manifest in verse 16. I will make your seed as the dust of aretz. Of course, in this sense, the dust of the earth. And then in verse 17, we encounter a tantalizing, if mysterious, key to why the Bible is telling us all about Abraham's travel itinerary. Verse 17, arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for unto you will I give it. Now, the promise, unto you will I give it, we've of course already seen. But note the additional emphasis here. Arise and walk through the land. Now, at this point, arising and walking through the land is not merely a travel itinerary. It is, quite literally, a divine command. So when we get to verse 18, and we read, again, the travel plans. And Abraham moved his tent and came and dwelt by the terebinths of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built there an altar unto God. So, at this point, of course, we're well accustomed to the altars. The altars are obviously part of Abraham's spiritual mission. But now that we've already read verse 17, we appreciate very well that the earlier part of the verse, Abraham moved his tent and so on, is also tantalizingly part of Abraham's spiritual mission. We may not know why. It may still be a question as to why that is a critical component of the spiritual mission, but evidently it is. God said so. God said, arise and walk through the land, in the length of it and in the breadth of it. So now we're left not so much trying to figure out why the Bible is telling us all about Abraham's travel plans. Our problem at this point is trying to understand why God has, in effect, made these travel plans so important. Because he has. After all, again, in God's words to Abraham, in verse 17, God affirms that going through the land is a critical component of Abraham's agenda. That's our challenge. Why does Abraham have to do that? Because, you know, the words of verse 17 give us, it would seem, a key to answering this question. But the key, in some ways, appears to make the mystery that much greater. Arise, walk through the land, and the length of it and the breadth of it, for unto you will I give it. That is, you're actually going through the land is somehow a crucial component of the actualization of God's promise. I'm promising you to give you the land. And that's why, because unto you I will give it, I'm telling you to get up and go. And go, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it. And of course, the obvious mystery here is God certainly doesn't need Abraham's walking through the land in order to actualize God's promise. God can take care of his promise very well on his own without Abraham doing anything. So of course we recognize God saying to Abraham to walk through the land because unto you will I give it, is not because Abraham's doing so is in any way necessary for God, but it is part and parcel of God's summons to Abraham. Now, of course, this is an issue that we've had occasion to discuss in the past. Obviously, everything that needs to be done in this world to make this world a more godly place, God could do perfectly well on his own. That he doesn't. And that rather, he charges us to do what he charges us to do, is clearly at the foundation of God's inscrutable plan for the world that he created. I say inscrutable plan, we've discussed this in the past, as so aptly expressed in Isaiah chapter 55, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, says God. So of course, on that plane we recognize we're not coming to understand what underlies divine thought that will perforce remain beyond us. But we do need to understand at least what the implications are for us, for our doing in this world, because that's what God charged us to do. And in order for us to fulfill that divine summons, of course, we need to know what it's expecting of us and what it means to us. So, to summarize, I know we've taken what seemed to be a pretty innocuous verse and made things seem very complicated. But there is a complexity here. Abraham is going through the land. The Bible tells us all about the itinerary. And in this verse, verse 17, we realize on some plane the answer is because going through the land, doing something, acting, is a critical part of Abraham's spiritual mission. Why? For unto you will I give it, will I give the land. And now we need to understand, what does that mean? Well, I stated at the outset, and I think it's critically important for us to return to this observation now. This is not a problem that is unique to Abraham. If anything, on the contrary, this is a problem that we encounter repeatedly in Scripture, in the life and times of the patriarchs, and more generally, in the lives and times of the prophets. Prophets doing things Well, from our perspective, we know the prophets through the written word that they bequeathed to us. We don't know the prophets in terms of what they did, but they did. They did a lot. And truth be told, a lot of the things they did strike us as just plain strange, to put it mildly. But maybe if we can get some kind of a handle, a key to understanding what both patriarchs and prophets do, we'll be able to understand why it's so important for Abraham to be going through the land. Maybe we'll even be able to understand more of why it's important for us to do the things we do, according to the Bible. Well, in order to get some sense of an answer to this question, I think it would help us to consider some really concrete examples as illustrations. I'd like to focus in particular on 3 such examples. Example number 1 is Jeremiah chapter 51. The citation here is starting with verse 59. You're obviously welcome to take a look at the verses that precede it. I'll just tell you now that the context of these verses is a very stern prophecy of doom and destruction of the Babylonian Empire. This is the next to last chapter of Jeremiah, and the central theme is the Babylonian Empire had its heyday, and it is heading for utter oblivion. And at the conclusion of this prophecy of doom and destruction for Babylon, we read in verse 59, the word which Jeremiah the prophet commanded Seraiah the son of Neriah, the son of Machseiah, when he, that is Seraiah, went with Tzidkiah, the king of Judah, to Babylon in the 4th year of his reign. Seraiah was quartermaster, and Jeremiah wrote in one book all the evil that should come upon Babylon, even all these words that are written concerning Babylon. Again, the foregoing words in chapter 51. And Jeremiah said to Seraiah, when you come to Babylon, then see that you read all these words and say, pay careful attention here. Verse 62. O Lord, you have spoken concerning this place to cut it off, that none shall dwell therein, neither man nor beast, but that it shall be desolate forever. And now Jeremiah continues his instructions to Seraiah, and it shall be, when you have made an end of reading this book, that you shall bind a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates. Well, if you tie a stone to the book, what's going to happen when you cast it into the Euphrates? It will, of course, sink. And you shall say, thus shall Babylon sink, and shall not rise again, because of the evil that I will bring upon her. And they shall be weary. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. Wow. What in the world is going on here? Why does the prophet issue this strange command to Seraiah to read the book and then tie a stone to it and cast it into the Euphrates so it'll sink? That is, the words aren't good enough that describe the doom and destruction of Babylon so graphically. So, in trying to answer this question, I suspect that our first approximation a possible solution is to say, well, remember, the prophets were teachers. We know very well that a lesson becomes so much more deeply ingrained in the audience if it's not just dry words. So you make this dramatic, I might even say theatrical presentation, and it sticks, and it has so much more clout to those who are watching the prophet than if it had just been Surayas reading the words. No, that is an answer. I just have to admit that I'm not so sure how satisfactory an answer that is here. Because remember, in verse 61, Jeremiah said to Suraya, when you come to Babylon, then see that you read all these words. He didn't tell him to read the words to any sort of audience. It's not clear in the words of the prophet that these words of doom and destruction to Babylon are to be read by Suraya in front of anyone at all besides himself. And likewise, when you get down to verse 63, binding a stone to the book and casting it into the Euphrates, there's no indication that there's any audience there either. So, of course, making the lesson dramatic for the audience is still a possibility. But it's very difficult to see how that could really be the answer here, if there isn't any indication there was any sort of audience altogether. And, of course, we can already sense at this point, this is not terribly different from Abraham's journeys. Abraham's journeys that are by divine summons, because God is giving him and his seed the land of Israel. There is that divine promise, that divine decree of bequeathing the land of Israel to Abraham and his seed. And yet, God charges Abraham with doing something actual, that, so to speak, begins the process of actualization of what would otherwise be merely an abstract, sublime decree. The moment you've done something, we know very well, we live in a world of action. In our world, actions speak louder than words. Actions speak volumes. And so, God commands Abraham, I'm giving you the land, but get up and take possession of it. Go through the land, the length of it and the breadth of it, because I'm giving it to you. It's not that you're going through the land is just going on a tour, but it's also not simply going to be the promise of the land without your doing anything on your own. And in Jeremiah chapter 51, while, of course, we don't read the divine command that prompts Jeremiah to instruct Suraya in the manner in which he does, it's kind of the same idea. You do something down here below in this world. The divine decree is up above. And God charges us as part of that process up above to act down below in actualizing that divine decree up above. This brings me to a little story that I'd like to share with you. The scene, the Yeshurun synagogue at the time, even to this day, one of the largest synagogues in Jerusalem. Some of you may have been there, on King George Street, the year 1937. The British have just promulgated their infamous white paper. For those who may not recall, the noose is tightening around the throats of European Jewry. Again, 1937. Just a year before Kristallnacht, 2 years before the war begins, and with it, the actualization of the final solution. The Jews of Europe are desperate. They realize they need to get out. But where are they going to go? Nearly all the countries of the earth refuse to accept them. There is only one destination, the land of Israel, the ancestral homeland. And in 1937, the British capitulate to Arab pressure and slam the doors shut on Jewish immigration to the land of Israel. Only the smallest trickle is able to reach the land, and that just as well as seals the fate on all of European Jewry facing extermination. And after the white paper is promulgated, there is a prayer rally that takes place at the Yeshurun synagogue. And at the climax of this prayer rally, the chief rabbi of the land of Israel at the time, Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, takes a copy of the white paper and very dramatically tears it up. Very dramatically, but not merely for the drama. Because he doesn't just tear up the white paper. He utters the prayer as he says it, as he does it. And as we tear this here down below, may you, God, tear it up above. If you ask, where did he get this idea from? My answer, of course, is pretty obviously, he got it from Jeremiah. Of course, undoubtedly, Jeremiah got it from God. But we read it in the words of Jeremiah. Not merely the dramatic deed, but appreciating that we live in the world of action, the action that actualizes what might otherwise be the abstraction of the divine decree. Now, on this score, we continue to my second example, because I think my second example drives this point home even more clearly. The scene here is in Kings 2. The prophet Elisha is upon his deathbed. We'll begin with verse 14 in chapter 13 of Kings 2. Elisha was full and sick of his sickness whereof he was to die. And Joash, the king of Israel, came down to him and wept over him and said, my father, the chariots of Israel and the horsemen thereof. Now mind you, as we read in the book of Kings, Joash, king of Israel, was not exactly a paragon of righteousness. But when he weeps over the impending death of Elisha, he makes it very clear why he's crying. True, Elisha used the self-same expression, chariots of Israel and its horsemen, when he sees the prophet Elijah, being taken from him. For Joash, it may have a much more pragmatic and literal sense. Elisha has been the great protector through his prophecies for the kingdom of Israel. And he's about to take his leave. And so, Elisha says to Joash, now pay attention to what's going on here. Elisha said to him, "Take bow and arrows." And he took unto him bow and arrows. And he said to the king of Israel, "Put your hand upon the bow." And he put his hand upon it. And Elisha laid his hands upon the king's hand. And he said, "Open the window eastward." And he opened it. Then Elisha said, "Shoot." And he shot. And he said, that is, Elisha said, "The Lord's arrow of victory, even the arrow of victory against Aram. For you shall smite the Arameans in Aphek till you have consumed them." Upon what basis? Well, in context here, upon the basis of a shot arrow. A shot arrow, in which the king shot the arrow from the window with Elisha's hands upon him. And that's not all. We continue. And he said, "Take the arrows." There's again Elisha saying to Joash, "Take the arrows." And he took them. And he said to the king of Israel, "Smite upon the ground." And he smote and stood. He smote 3 times only. And the following verse reads, "And the man of God was wroth with him, was upset at the king, and said, You should have smitten 5 or 6 times, then you would have smitten Aram till you had consumed it, whereas now you shall smite Aram 3 times." Now let's consider what that's telling us. Again, we have these 2 scenes back to back. One, in which the prophet tells the king to shoot the arrow from the window. Second, after the shooting of the arrow, is smiting arrows upon the ground. And the king smites the arrow on the ground only 3 times and not more. And the consequence of this is this dire indictment that because you only smote the ground with the arrows 3 times, you will only smite Aram 3 times, and you will not have consumed it. Which, of course, inevitably raises the question, did the prophet tell Joash how many times to smite the arrows on the ground? How is he supposed to know? On the one hand, we could respond, if the prophet tells you, smite arrows on the ground, you just keep on smiting until he tells you to stop. Which, of course, is a good argument. We are, after all, speaking of the man of God. But there may be an additional dimension based upon what we just discussed with respect to Abraham and with respect to Jeremiah. There's no indication in what Elisha tells Joash here that he is being punished for not having smitten the arrows on the ground more than 3 times. It's more like a reality. Your deed initiates the actualization of the divine decree. There is a divine decree of destruction against Aram, but you need to actualize it by what you do. And if you don't, the destruction will remain an unactualized potentiality. And so, returning to our story here, in effect, Elisha is saying, you had the opportunity to initiate the actualization. You didn't go further. All that's going to be is the smiting of Aram 3 times. Nothing more. Not to be construed again as a punishment per se, just rather a reality, an inescapable one. Deeds in this world have consequences, even with respect to the divine plan and even with respect to divine decrees. We need to do what we need to do. My final example, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this example because I realize our time is fairly limited, is what we read in Ezekiel chapter 4. In Ezekiel chapter 4, we read one of the stranger passages in the prophets, where the prophet is commanded to take a tile or a brick and lay it before him and trace upon it the image of Jerusalem, and then go through all of the various motions of laying siege, mind you, to the brick. That's the command here. To lay siege to the brick and to build forts upon the brick and cast up a mound against it, set camps also against it, set battering rams against it round about. All of this with respect to this brick. And then to take what's translated here as an iron griddle. Maybe the best way of rendering this into simple English is a frying pan. To take a frying pan and set it for a wall of iron between you and the city. And set your face toward it, and it shall be besieged. Not the city, the brick. And you shall lay siege against it. This shall be a sign to the house of Israel. And how long are you supposed to engage in this behavior? In verse 4, lie upon your left side and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it. According to the number of days that you shall lie upon it, you shall bear their iniquity. For I have appointed the years of their iniquity to be unto you a number of days, even 390 days. So you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. And after you're finished with 390 days of lying on your left side, over a year on your side, you turn over and lie on your right side for another 40 days, bearing the iniquity of the house of Judah. Now, the prophet is required to spend, according to the literal meaning of Scripture, well over a year just lying there. What follows in the continuation of the chapter, we won't go through this in detail, you're welcome, of course, to see this on your own, is the menu, what the prophet is supposed to be eating during this period. Verses 9 and 10 describe the menu. Verse 11 speaks of the drink, the water by measure, and then there is a somewhat more graceful description of how the food is to be prepared. There's a dialogue between the prophet and God over what he needs to do in making this sign. But the bottom line in verse 16 that God says to Ezekiel, "Son of man, behold, I will break the staff of bread in Jerusalem, and they will eat bread by weight and with anxiety. They will drink water by measure and an appallment, that they may want bread and water and be appalled one with another and pine away in their iniquity." This is the purpose of this vision that is conveyed to Ezekiel. But the actions, did Ezekiel actually do these things or not? The rather grisly description of how he's supposed to prepare the food, and moreover, describing him as just lying there for a total of 430 days, understandably prompts some commentators to say this is all something that happened in the prophetic vision of Ezekiel. It wasn't actually an external reality, but simultaneously, there are those who say that indeed it was. And we can, on the one hand, well understand those who posit that this couldn't have had taken place as an external reality. I mean, after all, the prophet would be making himself into a laughingstock. If he's supposed to be a teacher, an educator, then doing such weird things, if anything, will simply convince people that he's a madman. Of what avail would that be in fulfilling his mission as God's prophet? And yet, at this point, of course, we certainly can appreciate why doing something is very much part and parcel of the prophet's agenda. And furthermore, as for the argument that behaving in this manner is undoubtedly going to lead people to think that prophets are among a bunch of weirdos and madmen, I think it's instructive for us to consider one additional source that may bear upon this issue. And that is what we read in Kings 2, chapter 9. The circumstance, Elisha, the prophet, summons one of the apprentice prophets to go to anoint as king Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi. Why am I sharing this example with you? Will become clear in just a minute. Elisha says to the apprentice prophet, take the vial of oil and you go to Ramoth Gilad and find there Jehu, the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, and raise him up from among his brethren, take him to an inner chamber, pour the oil upon his head, and tell him he is anointed king over Israel. Now, I'll note that in the instructions, verse 3, Elisha says, immediately after you do that, open the door and flee, and don't tarry, which we can very well understand as a wise move, since the prophet will, in effect, be launching a rebellion against the current king. That is, Yehoram, son of Achav, is still king, and what Elisha is instructing the apprentice prophet to do is to launch a coup to destroy the dynasty of Achav. And what we read then and what follows is the young prophet, the young man, comes to Ramoth Gilad, and he finds Jehu in Ramoth Gilad. The context is instructive. He finds them in what we would describe nowadays as a meeting of the chiefs of staff of the army, the captains of the host. And this young man, this young prophet, basically breaks in on a meeting of all the generals of the army and says, I have a word with you. I have an errand with you, for you. Jehu says, which of us? And the young man says, to you. Now, before we even continue, just consider what's taking place over here. You would think that a young man, a young upstart whom nobody knows, breaks in on a meeting of the chiefs of staff. The likely reaction would be to, at the very least, kick him out, if not punish him severely. What business do you have going in this meeting? And yet, what in fact is the reaction of Jehu? Jehu basically adjourns the meeting because this young man wants to have a word with him. So, in verse 6, Jehu gets up, they go into an inner chamber, the young prophet pours the oil upon his head and tells him he is anointed as king over the people of God, over Israel, and he commands him to eradicate the dynasty of Achav, his master, to launch a coup. The entire house of Achav is to perish. Now remember, he is speaking in context to one of the generals. It would seem, since Jehu was the one who asked him, who do you want to talk to? That Jehu is the chief of staff. And Jehu has just been anointed as king by this prophet. Now, I'm skipping to what happens after the prophet finishes anointing him and telling him that he is to extirpate the entire house of Achav, the entire dynasty that is currently ruling, and Jehu now goes back to all those generals. Let's put ourselves in Jehu's position. What an awkward situation. He has just been told that the king, to whom he and all the other generals have sworn allegiance, he's supposed to kill. He's supposed to replace. And he comes back out to this meeting of the generals, and the generals say to him, Shalom, is all well? Everything okay? And they then ask him the question. In the Hebrew, it's Madua baha meshugah hazeh elecha. Why did this madman, this crazy one, come to you? So it's a delicate moment, and Jehu tries to shrug it off by saying, well, you know people like that. You know the man and his chatter. And they say, it's a lie. Tell us! No. They're relating to prophets as madmen, but they feel compelled to hear what it is that the prophets say. And Jehu doesn't have a choice here. He says, actually, he just anointed me as king. We might well expect these generals would immediately thrust their swords into him. After all, he's just informed them that he is usurping the throne from their Lord to whom they've all sworn allegiance. And what do? The text tells us they hastened and took every man his garment and put it under him on the top of the stairs and blew the horn, saying, Jehu is king. In other words, they may have considered the prophets to be madmen, but they have such unswerving confidence that the prophets speak faithfully in God's name, they're prepared to stake their lives on it. They make a makeshift throne and pledge allegiance to Jehu for no discernible reason other than a prophet of God told him God has designated him as king. Says a lot, doesn't it? Of course, on the one hand, the obvious lesson that emerges from here is people may have thought the prophets were weirdos, and they may have realized that prophets do strange things, but evidently that did not, by one iota, diminish the extent to which they believed in the words of the prophets. That's one point, and of course it's an important point. But especially in our context, I think there's an additional dimension to appreciate. What did this young prophet do? What did he do? He poured a flask of oil on someone's head. He did a deed. He did an action. And again, we recognize actions speak louder than words. In our world of action, when the prophet does something, that doing is of the greatest importance of all, because it's a deed. It's not just an abstraction. God makes the decrees, but he bids of us to do. And inevitably we recognize that this isn't just a message for Abraham. It's also not just a message for the prophets we discussed today, Jeremiah, Elisha, Elisha's apprentice. Really, it's a message for everyone who is being addressed by the divine command that tells us to do. Of course, I mean you, I, everyone. Everyone recognizing that the divine summons is a summons to act. That doesn't mean that God can't do it all on his own. God can do everything on his own. But God has bidden us to be his junior partners. Not, mind you, based upon what we've decided that we feel like doing, but rather the challenges with which he has bidden us to rise to the occasion. The charge that he has given us, that he expects us to fill. The deeds that he tells us to do. As he told Abraham, get up and go through the land. And it is he, undoubtedly, who bid Jeremiah to tell Sraya, don't just read the words, tie the stone, throw it into the Euphrates, thus shall Babylon sink. And likewise, Elisha, I'm not just telling you that there is a divine decree of retribution against Aram. I want you to take the arrows and shoot them and smite them on the ground and do. Not because God needs it, but because God is bidding you to take the action, and you need to become God's junior partner. And so it is Elisha's apprentice anointing Jehu. And everyone recognizes, it's not just an abstraction. He's done the deed. The decree is headed towards actualization, because that's the way God does things. And we too then are bidden to do the deed. Living as we do in a world that on so many planes requires fixing up, we need to do. We need to act. We need to respond to the divine summons, to respond to the divine deed, to make this world a more godly place. May we hear the call. May we do the deed. May we respond to God's summons. God bless you.